Lately, I've seen some discussion around Wuthering Waves and the way it's been telling its story, specifically about how character stories are no longer being treated as optional side content, but are being folded directly into the main storyline. For some players, that shift feels uncomfortable. The pacing feels different, the focus feels narrower, and when the main story centers on a character you're not personally invested in, it can be harder to stay engaged. I read those reactions, I understood them, and honestly, I felt that friction myself. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. I don't think this is actually a narrative failure, I think it's a mismatch. And that mismatch comes from the story choosing continuity over individual preference, between what the story is doing structurally and how individual players emotionally connect to its characters. So instead of asking whatever this change is good or bad, I want to talk about why it feels bad for some people even when from a storytelling perspective it actually makes sense. Because once you separate personal engagement from narrative structure, this entire debate becomes a lot clearer. So let's talk about why this feels like a problem for a lot of players. Wuthering Waves has a growing cast, and with any large cast there's an unavoidable reality. You're not going to connect with everyone. That's not a failure of writing, it's not a design flaw, it's just how people work. Different players latch onto different characters, different personalities, different archetypes, different dynamics. And that means something important happens when character-focused stories move into the main narrative. If the story centers on a character you already care about, your engagement goes up. But if it centers on a character you don't connect with, your engagement drops, even if the writing is good. And that's the core of the frustration. This isn't about quality, it's about alignment. For example, I'll be very honest here, I personally have a harder time getting invested in male characters in gacha games. That's just how my preferences work. That doesn't mean their stories are bad, it doesn't mean they're poorly written, it doesn't mean they shouldn't exist. It just means that when the main story focuses on them, it's naturally harder for me to stay emotionally engaged. And that experience is going to be different for every player. Some players felt this during Yuno's story, some during Chisa's story, some during Linne's story, and eventually everyone is going to hit a moment where the story asks them to invest in someone they just don't click with. And when that happens in the main story, not optional content, it can feel like the game is forcing engagement. But that feeling doesn't automatically mean the story is doing something wrong. It means the story is prioritizing cohesion over personalization. And that distinction is where this conversation usually breaks down. This is where I want to draw a very important line. There's a difference between a story not landing for you and a story not working. And in Wuthering Waves' case, I don't think anything is actually broken. Narratively speaking, the structure holds. The character arcs are coherent, motivations are clear, events flow logically from one to another. When a character becomes central to the main story, there's a reason for it. Their backstory connects to the larger conflict, their choices move the plot forward, their presence isn't arbitrary. And most importantly, these stories are integrated, not stapled on. They're not optional side content pretending to be important, they're written as part of the spine of the narrative. So from an objective storytelling standpoint, nothing here is failing. The pacing isn't collapsing, the themes aren't contradicting each other, the story isn't losing track of itself. And this is the framing I really want to emphasize. A story can be well written and still not emotionally land for everyone. That, of course, doesn't invalidate your reaction, but it also doesn't automatically indict the writing. What's happening here isn't a structural error, it's a mismatch between who the story needs to focus on and who you personally want to focus on. And those two things aren't always going to line up. That's especially true in games with larger casts, where the main story can be tailored to individual preference. So when people say, this should have been a side story, what they often mean is, I wish this had been optional for me. And that's a very human reaction, but it's not the same thing as a narrative mistake. And this becomes really clear once we look at the moment where this shift actually happens. Because for most players, this conversation didn't start in theory, it started with Yuno. This is where the discussion really crystallized. For a lot of players, this whole debate started with one moment, Yuno's story. When her arc became part of the main story, a lot of people said the same thing. This should have been a side story. And I understand why that reaction exists. If you weren't particularly invested in Yuno as a character, having the main story slow down to focus on her can absolutely feel frustrating. But here's where I fundamentally disagree. Yuno's story couldn't have been a side story, not without breaking the narrative, and the reason becomes obvious the moment you look at what actually happens in her arc. Yuno doesn't just get character development, she gets erased. Her existence is altered, everyone loses their memory of her. Everyone except the protagonist. And at that point, the story cannot just move on. If Yuno's arc was optional, the main story would be asking the protagonist to do something absurd. To know that someone they bonded with, someone important, has effectively vanished from the world and then just continue as if nothing happened. That wouldn't be player freedom, that would be narrative incoherence. Yuno's arc isn't self-contained, it isn't optional flavor, it isn't backstory happening on the side. It directly alters the state of the world, the protagonist's knowledge, the emotional context, the stakes going forward. If you strip that out and label it as optional, the main story would either have to awkwardly summarize events the player may not have seen or pretend those events didn't matter, and either options would weaken the narrative. So I want to be very clear about this. Yuno's story wasn't promoted into the main story, it was always part of it. What changed wasn't the writing, it was the willingness to commit, and once that door opened, the direction of the story became clear. Because after Yuno, this wasn't a one-off anymore. Once you choose to make consequences matter, you lose the ability to make that content optional without rewriting the entire premise. We saw the same approach with Chisa, and then with Linne. The game made a choice. Characters' arcs that change the state of the world belong to the main story, even if that means not every player will be equally invested in every chapter. And that's where the real tension is. Not between good or bad writing, but between narrative integrity and personal attachment. And once you see it that way, the conversation shifts completely. Because this stops being about one character arc and starts being about a structural choice. There are basically two ways a live service story like Wuthering Waves can handle a character-focused narrative. Option 1, you keep character stories as side content. They're optional, they're skippable, they only matter if you personally care. But the cost is fragmentation. The main story becomes thinner. Important emotional context lives outside the core narratives, and over time, the canon starts to feel incomplete. Option 2. You integrate character arcs directly into the main story. They're no longer optional. They're no longer curated to individual taste. They become part of the spine of the narrative. And that's the choice Wuthering Waves made. Not because it guarantees everyone will enjoy every arc, but because it protects continuity. It keeps the story whole, it keeps cause and effect intact, and it avoids the problem of asking players to understand the world through content they may or may not have played. And yes, that choice has a cost. It means there will be stretches where the character doesn't resonate with you. It means engagement will fluctuate from player to player. But that's not a narrative failure, that's the trade-off. Wuthering Waves chose narrative cohesion over emotional uniformity. And that's not a mistake, it's a prioritization. You're not being asked to love every arc equally. You're being asked to follow a story that refuses to break itself apart just to stay universally comfortable. And whatever that works for you or not, that part is personal. So I understand why this change frustrates some players. I really do. When a character you don't connect with becomes central, it can make the story feel slower, less engaging, harder to emotionally latch onto. And honestly, that's going to happen to me too. There will absolutely be arcs where I'm less invested, characters that just don't click with me the same way others do. But narratively, I respect this decision. I respect a story that's willing to be clear about what matters instead of hiding importance behind optional content. I'd rather be less invested in some chapters than constantly wonder which ones matter. Because clarity builds trust. It tells me this is the story, this is the canon, and this is the path forward. And once that trust is there, I can accept the uneven moments. Because I know the narrative isn't quietly fragmenting behind the scenes. So no, I don't think Wuthering Waves made the wrong choice here. They made a deliberate one. And even when it doesn't land perfectly for me, I'd rather follow a story that commits to itself rather than one that keeps asking me to guess what actually mattered. The story doesn't have to please everyone, to be honest. It just has to know what it is. If you made it this far, thanks for listening, genuinely. This isn't a video about being right or wrong. It's about how stories make choices, and how those choices land differently depending on the player. I'm really curious where you fall on this one. Do you prefer character stories staying optional, or do you like them being fully integrated into the main narrative, even when they don't always click for you? Let me know in the comments. I've been really enjoying these conversations. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.